afternoon, students. I am sorry that I'm not there with you guys in person or virtually in person, even. But I'm recording here. Hopefully, we will have the technology stuff sorted out for next time. But I want to send you guys greetings from the jungle of Ecuador in the upper Amazon. It's really incredible that I can be here with you guys from such a distance, and that we can share this kind of information with you all in this way. And so, I'm gonna start out by just giving you guys a general orientation about where where I am and the kind of the environment that exists here. And unfortunately, I won't be able to interact much with you guys. I won't be able to ask you questions, but maybe I can ask you questions and then kind of give pauses, and Katrina can like pause the video and be like, well, what do you guys think? So anyway, but yeah, so let's just start out and give you guys a little orientation. This right here is where I live. This is Sumac Kausai in situ, our reserve on top of this ridge. This is the Ansu River. It goes down into the lower Amazon. As you can see, it kind of goes down into the lowlands there. And so we're in the first hills before going into the Andean mountain chain. So you can see here, and this video unfortunately is super glitchy. I don't know why. But the idea here is just to let you guys see what the landscape is like. You can see there's a lot of forest. There's our neighbor's house there at the bottom. And going up, this is the Ansu River coming down here. You can see a lot of forest. Another video, Ansu River. And then we're panning up, and you're going to see the first mountain chain of the Andes, what's called the Abitagua, the Cordillera Abitagua. And as you can see, those are pretty big mountains, but what you can't see is behind them, there are even bigger mountains. And then behind that chain, there's even bigger mountains. And behind that chain, there are snow-capped volcanoes. So it's a really incredible area with a lot of variation, a lot of topography, which is a term we'll talk more about here in a little bit. But this is the Ansu River, and it comes out of these mountains. And so these mountains represent the very highest part of the Amazon watershed. Okay, so I'll ask you now, who knows what a watershed is? Okay, this, for example, is the Amazon watershed. And so maybe we can pause now, talk about what a watershed is. Okay, now that you've discussed, I'll tell you what it is. A watershed can be a little misleading because it's not just, why is my cursor only showing up on here? That is bothersome to me. So a watershed isn't just comprised of the lakes and rivers and water. It's actually the geographic area, the land area, in which all of the water that falls goes to a central place. In this case, the Amazon River. And more specifically, this river delta right here. So all of the rain, all of the water that falls in this green area eventually ends up here. And actually, for the sake of conceptualizing the watershed, I say it that way. It's actually not true. An interesting fact, the Amazon watershed is so big that much of the water evaporates. It's something like 1/10 of the water droplets or of the water molecules that enter the watershed actually make it to the ocean, which is super interesting. Now, why would that be? Evaporation. So a lot of evaporation occurs as well, and we'll talk more about that. But for now, you need to know this green area is the land area that comprises the Amazon watershed, which is the largest watershed in the world. It contains 25% of the Earth's surface freshwater in just one watershed. That's 1/4 of the Earth's surface freshwater. Okay, so talking about a huge area here. And where am I located? Can anybody put a dot on the map for where I am right now? I'll give you a hint. Up the Amazon, up the Amazon, up. until we get to Iquitos, Peru. We'll actually continue going up the Napo, to the very highest part of the watershed, Sumac Causa in situ, right between the Pastasa and the Napo headwaters. Headwaters are where a watershed is birthed, where it is born. And so what that means is that the water from here in Sumac goes down and passes by all of this land here below until the Atlantic Ocean, which means what happens up here in the headwaters of this watershed is very important because it's going to affect everybody downstream, right? So here's Sumac again, so you can get orient yourselves a little bit better. This is the lower Amazon, the flatlands, and so once the watershed comes out of the mountains, it gets pretty flat, and that's the classic flat, snaking, brown river that you see photos of the Amazon River. That's down here, but actually where we are, the water's very different. They're whitewater rivers, and there's topography, but we're just in the part right between this transition zone between the lowlands and the big mountains in what's called the Piedmont. They're kind of like the hills that form right before you get a mountain chain. It's a very interesting ecological and environmental situation or location, and we'll get more into that later. Here's a 3D map so you can visualize even more that coming out of these lowlands, Sumac is located right here. So right before you get to the big mountains, and an area that's very interesting geologically as well. And we'll talk more about that. So now we're going to go into talking about environments and ecosystems. So maybe you guys, I'll go ahead and ask if anybody knows what an ecosystem is. What is an ecosystem? What is an environment? Maybe you guys can talk a little bit about that. And you may not know, and I've got slides here that go into that a little bit further, so you guys will get an idea. So when we talk about ecosystems and environments, we're going to start broad and at the foundation, which is the geology and geologic formations, which go way, way back and have a very old history, but the geology affects everything else from there on out. So, for instance, the geology gives rise to different soil types, and the soil types are going to dictate what kinds of plants can live there. Okay, so we're talking about this system, interconnected system, and its foundation is really kind of the geology. And so here in this region of Ecuador, have various geologic zones. I can even show you, maybe, or maybe not. Yeah. So these are different rock formations, geologic formations, and we are actually in Mera right here in this super active area with a bunch of different geologic zones. But the most predominant geologic formations here are the karst topography and karst geography comprised of limestone rocks like this. And limestone is a type of rock that is also abundant in Virginia. It was formed by oceans. So when you have oceans, you have a lot of marine critters like oysters and clams, other mollusks, and when they die, their shells go to the bottom of the ocean, and their shells contain a lot of calcium. And so that calcium dissolves and then forms a layer, and over millions of years turns into rock. And so that's where you get this calcium-based rock, which also preserves very well. It's a type of sedimentary rock, which means over time it compresses. It's basically organic matter that eventually petrifies. And here you can see these are actually shells. These are actually fossils of marine critters. This was some marine shell that got fossilized in this layer of calcium matter on the bottom of the ocean. So what's interesting there is that there are actually this whole area where we're located at the base of these mountains. This was actually an inland sea 2 times throughout the geologic history due to various geologic processes, but the ocean, the Atlantic Ocean, inundated this area and that's why we get these rocks. And so that's important to know that geologic history, because that gives us context to how this ecosystem formed to be what we see today. For instance, these rocks provide a habitat for this lady slipper orchid that is unique to these rocks. They grow on the rocks by this river. And so this is an example of how the geology has formed the botanical composition of this area, with various other plants that also live on the rocks. So geology, we're going to talk today a little bit about abiotic and biotic factors. And I'll just skip down here. So abiotic factors are non-living factors. Biotic refers to biology, the study of living things. So biotic means living. Abiotic, the A there means not. So not living, abiotic, and biotic are living things. Okay? So an ecosystem is comprised of abiotic and biotic factors that are interconnected and have specific relationships, right? And that those specific relationships are what form the ecosystem, the environment, and its specific composition. Okay, so with that in mind, we now have some of our abiotic factors in mind, this rock, for instance. Okay, and we're going to talk a little bit more about other abiotic factors that are important. For instance, weather, okay? And the weather in this region is super, super interesting and unique. It's actually one of the rainiest places on Earth, which is important. And so you can see here, we have this giant watershed. And there's a specific phenomenon that happens here that's called a rain shadow effect. And basically what happens is, in this giant watershed, a lot of evaporation occurs. Again, it's tropical here too, it's hot. So all the water in these giant rivers evaporates and turns into clouds. And the weather patterns in this region actually the wind blows all of those clouds into the mountains, okay? So everything gets blown from the watershed here up towards Ecuador until it hits that chain of mountains, in Peru and Colombia as well, but in our specific case, we're talking about Ecuador. So here, the mountains of Ecuador, clouds get blown up, the clouds run into those giant mountains, and they can't get past the mountains, so they sit there, and then they end up dropping all of that water. And so it rains on these eastern slopes of the Andes, and it rains a lot. Specifically, in our case, right here, those clouds are hitting these first big mountains and sitting in right over top of Sumac. So this is actually one of the rainiest places on Earth. This is a rainfall map. We're going to talk more about maps later today, but maps are really important for how we conceptualize and visualize ecological systems. So in this case, Ecuador is represented here with the rainfall distribution, precipitation in Ecuador. We're actually located right here in the highest precipitation amount. This is precipitation in Mera that ranges up to 5,500 millimeters a year, which is 5.5 meters of water, which is about 20 feet of rain a year. Can you imagine? So it is very wet here, and that's important. Another factor that's very important to keep in mind when talking about the ecology of this region is temperature, okay? So here is a temperature graph of where we are. And as you can see, 20 degrees Celsius equates to about 68 degrees Fahrenheit. But you can see there's almost no variation throughout the year here. Okay, so to give you guys a little bit of perspective, if this map were done for Virginia, it would start here on the first month, January, very low, right? We'd have temperatures down here in Virginia. And then as we go through February, it's still cold. But then getting warmer through March, April, May, okay, and then actually getting even higher than here in August. We're definitely getting up here until those late months again when we start, okay, fall, and then winter, right? But here it's very stable. So maybe you guys can take a few minutes to talk about, well, why is the temperature here so stable, but in Virginia it's highly variable? And then if you go, for instance, even further north in Alaska, what's the weather like there? Okay, so maybe talk about why is the temperature here in Ecuador very stable and warm, whereas in Virginia you have seasons, and then in Alaska you have very few seasons with an extremely long winter. What is the influencing factor there? Maybe take a few minutes to talk about that if you want. I'll go ahead and tell you that it's because of the equator, the proximity to the equator, okay, which is actually called latitude. These are latitudinal lines, and latitude 0 goes right through Ecuador, and Ecuador actually means equator in Spanish, named after its location here on the equator. And what that means is, given the rotation of the Earth, the equator is always somewhat close to the sun, is always fairly close to the sun, and doesn't get that same seasonality as the higher latitudes. Like up in Canada, there's a part of the year when the rotation of the Earth keeps this area very distant from the sun, so you get shorter days, you get colder days. But here on the equator, the days are almost equal year round, and likewise the temperature is very stable as well. So that's important for understanding the biotic composition of the ecosystem, because what that means is there's no inactive season, right? And you talk about, for instance, trees in Virginia are inactive for part of the year because it gets cold and they shed their leaves, and then they're inactive. Well, that doesn't happen here. The critters are active year round because it's always nice and comfortably warm. So that leads to a greater amount of biodiversity, which is an important ecological factor we'll talk about later as well down the road. So again, precipitation, very important. Going over abiotic factors, again, going back to geology, shows some interesting stuff here. Some of the caves, and I wish these videos would actually work. That's super frustrating, but these are some of the caves in this region that are super abundant and super cool to explore. Over 35 caves in the upper watershed. And there were some other videos I was going to put in here, but I didn't get around to it. But anyway, here's a different cave we actually went to this past weekend. You have to rappel into it, which is really cool, and then ascend out of it with ropes and harnesses and everything. Just absolutely beautiful. And there's actually here a community school group in a cave in the Upper Ansu. Our tour last year, and that's my brother Matt telling people about geology. So there's a lot of cool geology in this region. And we studied the geology, actually, the subterranean ecology, to be more precise. And so looking at those abiotic factors and the biotic factors and how they relate. And so we have a method, and we're not going to talk much about it now, but there's a methodology we use to measure those various factors and compare them in a standardized way. And so here's our data sheet, for instance, in our pin and our thermometer. This is here's some critters that we find in the caves. This is actually an amphipod. It's a type of crustacean that we believe is a new species entirely. You can tell that it lives in a cave because it's transparent. It almost has no pigment. And that is a trait typical of cave-dwelling organisms, that they don't need much pigment because there's no light in the caves. You can't really see the colors anyway, right? Same thing with this subterranean crayfish that's largely transparent with a little bit of pigmentation. Okay, other interesting critters that live in the caves that we study. Here is a watusa. It's a large mammal. Some of you guys might be familiar with capybaras, which are the largest species of rodent. This is a similar critter. It's also a rodent, but smaller and terrestrial. And they like to make their nests in the caves here as well. So here's another example of the cave, a geologic formation, providing a habitat or a home for this watusa, and in that way, that's the specific nature of the relationship here, the geology and the animal. And so, again, talking about relationships within an environment is what makes up the ecological composition. Okay, so now we've talked about a lot of those different abiotic factors: geology, climate, soil. Okay, from there, that leads us to the biotic factors. Okay, and the first really broad class of biotic factors is going to be vegetation or botanical structure. Okay, and the botanical structure of an area is going to greatly influence the rest of the biotic composition of that environment as well. That is to say, the animals that live there, and the bacteria and other things like that. So trees provide a habitat for a lot of other organisms, and we study those things here in Ecuador. We are doing investigations on forest stages and the forest in general, and using things like this spherical densitometer to assess canopy coverage, like how closed or open the canopy is. We see that that actually has an influence on the various animals that live here. Also, looking at the size of trees, we use a measurement called diameter at breast height. That's just the diameter of the tree. And that is a measure that helps us estimate, for instance, the successional stage of the forest, whether it's an old forest or a young forest. These are the different successional stages you can see down here on the bottom, from an area that's been either burned or cut, that's open, and then the forest starts to grow back. Okay, and that's called succession. It's called forest succession. And here is like a very old growth, a mature forest. We call it primary forest. And here's a secondary forest that is in the process of regenerating. And these are disturbed areas. Okay, so these things affect the composition of the ecosystem as well. The vegetation structure is very, very important. What kind of forest, and how the condition of the forest, the composition of the forest, very important for the ecosystem in general. And then, talking about biotic factors, we also have animals, which could be anything from this girl here, Valerie, to this jaguar, or bacteria or fungi, right? And those are other examples of biotic factors. And we study, for instance, in this specific case, we study large mammals in the Ansu watershed using camera traps. So this is a methodology that allows us to study certain biotic components of this ecosystem, specifically the large mammals. And that's a motion-activated camera that gets triggered, and then it gets triggered, for instance, by the movement of this jaguar walking by. And then it records a video, and it also records the temperature and the date and the time. Very important information. So, a bunch of different critters that we've recorded in this region. Here, A and D are two jaguars. This is a puma, an ocelot. There's actually 5 species of large cats in this region. And in this class later on in the semester, we are going to talk more about camera trap work, but this is just a preview to show you guys there's some cool content that we're going to be dealing with big cats and real data that is being collected in the field here in the Amazon, and it's cool to be able to share that with you guys. So I hope you get excited about it, because not all students studying online right now have the opportunity to study this kind of thing. So so the big cats. All right, so now we've got a basic idea of ecology, what ecology is, and what it's comprised of ecological factors, right? Of abiotic and biotic factors, okay? And we've got a little activity now to review those factors, and what I want you guys to do is sort them. So you have your list here is a mixed list of various biotic and abiotic factors. I think Katrina has printouts for you, and I'll let her explain the rest of that, but you're going to sort them and say what's biotic and what's abiotic. Okay, pause. Coming back, I assume you guys have done your activity, you've done your sorting, you've maybe discussed, and I'm going to give you guys the correct answers now. Okay, so here's the sorted list. We can see in the abiotic, there's things like water and precipitation, soil. Again, soil is not living. Soil is the product of rocks that are broken down. Okay, geologic formations again. Same thing with wind. A car, for instance, is not living, although it was made by a living thing, which is an interesting intermediate. Temperature. And then biotic factors, we have forest, obviously made up of trees and other plants, so that those are living things. Any kind of predator, for the jaguar, for instance, the living thing. So predators are a very important ecological factor. Cattle might be an example, is an example of a biotic factor, or a dog, for instance. Any kind of animal. Phytoplankton, fungi being not an animal but a different kind of living organism, humans even. And then virus I threw in there to make you guys think a little bit. Viruses are interesting examples, kind of case study of they contain many characteristics of living organisms, but in other ways they have characteristics of non-living organisms, or don't uh, possess certain essential characteristics of biotic, of living organisms. Okay, so anyway, not super important, but just to make you guys think. And of course, viruses are very relevant in the present day, given our pandemic. So anyway, viruses are interesting. Point being. All right, we're not going to get into those slides. But yeah, I hope you guys have talked a little bit about the ecological factors, what goes into those things. These are not all of the ecological factors. These are just the ones that, these are just some, a list that came to me off the top of my head. So anyway, there's many other examples as well. And we're going to skip ahead now to talking about maps, okay? So when we talk about ecology, maps are really important for visualizing and conceptualizing information. In this case, this watershed map helps us understand the Amazon region as a whole, and is also very important for understanding the weather patterns, because that gives us, it allows us to visualize, okay, this is a massive watershed with a ton of surface fresh water in a tropical area that experiences heat. That's going to cause a lot of evaporation, and then that's eventually going to cause that rain shadow effect. So that map helps us communicate and visualize how the rain shadow effect functions, basically, right? So when talking about ecology, maps are super, super important, and there are lots of different kinds of maps. And the cool thing is that we can make maps specific to vary whatever we want, really. So if you have some specific thing that you want to relate, for instance, I'm doing a study of pit viper, a species of snake here in Ecuador, and I've done specific maps that represent the distribution of the snake. Okay, and so in that case, I want to publish my data and show people what the distribution of the snakes are like. The map is going to help me do that best. So anyway, we're talking about maps, and there are two really broad classes of maps: physical maps and political maps. Okay, and political doesn't just mean like politics and elections or government, etc. Political refers to anything social, basically social constructs. Physical are things that exist apart from humans. So, for instance, a weather map is the weather is something that exists very apart from social structure from humans. Geologic map is the same basic concept there, nothing to do with us. Ecological maps, species distributions. A bathymetric. Anybody know what that is? That's getting a little technical. A bathymetric map actually maps the topography of underwater areas. So the landscape underwater of like craters and the oceans, basically. Okay, so again, something that is not human related. Whereas political map, for instance, a time zone. Time zones don't exist aside from humans. We made time zones for social reasons and agricultural reasons. Zip codes, same thing. That serves a social purpose. Aside from humans, there are no zip codes. Election results, obviously a very political topic there. Political boundaries, that being states, cities, countries. Again, the country of Mexico does not exist it does not exist outside of the human conceptualization or basically what we have imposed upon the land there. If it weren't for humans, it would just be a landform. It wouldn't have a name. It wouldn't have any boundaries. Income, another example. These are just a few examples. There are many, many more. Okay, so anyway, I've got several maps here that the idea is to just go through each one. You guys saying what kind of map, a political or a physical map. Okay, so we've got a map of Central America here. Tell me, what do you think? Physical or political? I'll go through. What about this one? And Katrina, I'll just let you pause on each one of these if you guys want to discuss. But I'll show you each one here. It's a different map. You can't even see. Yeah. So take a good look at that one. And there's going to be various clues in these maps. Actually, ignore this part here. We're really going to be looking at this map and this map. So you got to look for clues. What's actually noted in this map? What are the features? What's given there? Same thing with this, and you can see this actually has it has the top view looking down at the land, as well as a cross section. Which a cross section, in this specific case, provides very important and relevant information for visualizing these geologic strata. Okay, what about this one? Oh, there's definitely some information there that would give it away. Here we've got a different one here. What would that be? You guys, we'll take this opportunity to talk about topography. Topography is the land form, so the structure of the landscape and its elevation. So this, for instance, is a topographic representation as well. This is a topographic map. You can see the mountains rising out and then the flatter lands down here, right? And so in this case, this map doesn't actually show the 3D structure, but these lines allow us to conceptualize that topography, and in which the lines that are very close together show a very steep topography, a steep grade. So this is a mountain right here. You can see this is the elevation, and it's going up kind of gradually until, wow, you hit a really steep section here, levels off a little bit, and kind of flat at the top. This area, for instance, is very flat because these lines go up incrementally with the numbers. So there's one line every 50 feet of elevation, for instance. Okay, and so that is why these are super close together, is because you go up 50 feet very, very quickly in a very short horizontal distance. So we'll talk more about topographic maps in this class, and topography is an important aspect of ecology and ecosystems. Any idea on this one? Physical, political, more specifically, what kind of map? I'll go ahead and tell you. It is a watershed map, which is a type of physical map. But this also has some political boundaries as well. So, it's not always cut and dry, and a lot of maps have a mix of, certain political factors, boundaries, and then physical characteristics as well. Topography and rainfall. The topography you can see given kind of the 3D structure. And again, we can see the rainfall is super, super high right in this area where sumac is. And a useful map for visualizing that rainfall. It's a map of species distributions on looking at the elevation between two species, Microphthalmus and Hyperora. It actually shows how they overlap here. So in this specific case, I wanted to represent sympatry. Sympatry means overlap of species distribution. So two sympatric species live in the same place. So, for instance, you, the students of community school, are sympatric with the gray squirrel, which is also found in community school. As are these two species, Hyperora and Microphthalmus, sympatric in between 1,500 meters and 600 meters of elevation, right where sumac is. Just a few more quick maps. Here is a reserve map. This has some physical features like topography on it as well, and the satellite imagery showing forests but it also has these political designations, which are the reserves in this area, reserves that wouldn't exist aside from humans designating them as such. Here is a trail map, okay? So these are maps that I made that have been very useful for me. There's a lot of physical characteristics and some political characteristics here as well, like the boundary of our reserve. And this trail map relates a lot of different information. It relates certain points of interest, like this waterfall here, or this observation area, a bird observation area. It notes different habitat types like the primary forest, secondary forest, agricultural area, and then scientific study areas as well. So a lot of interesting stuff there. And we also, I included, when I made this map, I included an elevation map as well, an elevation profile. Now, an elevation map isn't something you're going to want to include in every map. For instance, it's not going to be necessary for a trail map in Oklahoma, for instance, or Illinois. Why? Well, because it's really elevation is kind of a non-factor in the Midwest. There's not much variation. It's fairly flat. So you go out on the trail, you don't really need to know that it's going to be flat the whole, or you don't really need to visualize that it's going to be flat the whole time. Whereas here, there's a whole lot of up and down, and it can be helpful for people to see, oh wow, this is a pretty tough trail. I'm not going to want to take that one. So when we make maps, we have to think about what's relevant information, what's contextually important. So what is the purpose of the map? And given that purpose, what do I need to include? What aspects do I need to include? And so in this specific case, for instance, I said, okay, I'm going to make a trail map. What's important for a trail map for tourists to come? Well, they're going to want to know what the specific attractions are. Waterfalls, rivers, rappelling, different types of habitats for the scientists that come here. So I included various things, and then of course the trails themselves and the elevation. There's various other factors there. Here's a transect map as well. So different type of trail map, specifically oriented towards scientific investigation. So transects are like scientific trails. This is a 200-meter trail that is used specifically for the observation of reptiles and amphibians. And then you got the scale and the various other parts. So Katrina is going to talk to you guys more about the components of map making, how you do that, and then we've got an activity here in your classroom called Name That Map, and you've got various options here for each map. There are 14 maps, and I want you to read the maps, look at them, closely, and that if you really look at them closely, you should be able to figure out what kinds of maps. So anyway, that's the gist of it. I hope this video is going to be somewhat long and and heavy in terms of space. So hopefully it won't take long to upload. Hopefully this is all good information and it made sense. I'm sorry we couldn't have had more of a dynamic kind of conversation or interaction with you guys. But I hope all is well. And we'll continue to talk about some really cool stuff, and we've got good activities lined up for the rest of this Friday group. And I'm looking forward to continuing to share this information and tell you guys a little bit about where I am and what I do. And it's good content, interesting content to talk about science. So I actually didn't even get to talk about all of my science stuff today, but we'll have more time, and hopefully Katrina can answer questions. Any other questions you guys can write to me. Katrina can write to me, and we'll continue to be in touch. So anyway, take care, guys, and I will see you all soon. Bye.